Hello, good evening. Welcome to the Trails Radio Show. Thank you for joining us this evening. Today, my special guest is Mr. Scotty Brink. Thank you, and join us in a minute. Okay, my first question to you is, how did you get started in the industry? How did your career begin?
Well, it was almost by accident. I was a teenager. I was 16. I lived in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, where I was raised. I'd been on the radio with my band. I had a band, and we played various places around the area. And we also had a radio show, but I never talked on that radio show. But then I noticed something on the bulletin board at school one day, at my high school, that said they were looking for a part-time announcer at one of the local radio stations. Not the one I had the radio show on, but another one. So I called the program director of that radio station and asked if I could audition. He said, come on down. I auditioned, and I got the job. So I worked weekends for about a year, and then about a year later, while I was a senior in high school, one of the other stations in town offered me a full-time position, and I took that. And that's the way, that took care of the rest of my high school career.
Yeah. Once you get in the industry, you're in it for a while, if you enjoy it,
Well, it's interesting. I had other plans, other ideas of what I was going to do after I left school, but this definitely dissuaded me and made me think this may be a career in this. And about a year after I left high school, about a year out of high school, I was working in York, Pennsylvania, at a radio station, WSBA, which is really a great radio station. And it had a big signal, and people listened to it all over the place. It was a very popular radio station in south central Pennsylvania. And I got a telephone call one afternoon after I got off the air from a man who was the program director of a station in Philadelphia, which was, at that time, probably the highest rated radio station on the entire East Coast. It had incredible ratings in Philadelphia. And it was very famous. And at first I thought it was a friend of mine playing a joke on me and telling me he was the program director of this radio station and that he's going to offer me a job for all this money. Well, and I actually said to the guy, I called him Bill because I thought it was my friend Bill. And he said, excuse me? And I suddenly realized I'm not talking to Bill. And he said, would you be, I'm Roy Schwartz, and I'm the operations manager at WIVG in Philadelphia. Would you be interested in coming to work for us? And of course, I was, at that point, my heart was in my throat. And I said, I would. He said, would you like to come down and talk to me about it? I said, well, what time do you get there in the morning? He said, I'm usually there around 9 o'clock. So the next morning, I got up real early and drove to Philadelphia. And I was waiting at the radio station when he arrived. And when he arrived and saw how old I was, not a 30-year-old guy with all this experience that he usually hired, he was pretty flabbergasted, but he hired me anyway. And I worked at that radio station for about 5 years before going on to Los Angeles.
Yeah. Are you still in radio? Or are you retired?
No, I'm retired. I'm sitting here on the patio of my house in Indian Wells, California. And my wife and I we've only been here for a few months. We've been in Oklahoma for many years. But no, I've totally retired from the business and actually haven't done anything with radio now probably for a decade. For a while I was doing a radio show in Chicago from my house in Oklahoma.
Wow. Yeah, that's the great thing about internet. Now you can do your radio show from home now,
Yeah, you can. It's a whole different business now than it was then, Trey. Everything is so totally different. You had mentioned to me before we started this interview that you probably want to talk about how I advise people getting into the business now. And I'm kind of hard-pressed to do that because my story really couldn't happen now. Because when I went to Philadelphia, at that radio station, when I was 19 years old, I did the all-night show. I was on from midnight, actually 1 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock in the morning. And it was amazing. That station was so popular that I had a gigantic audience, and I was very well known. And it was an amazing thing. But there are no radio stations anymore, I don't think, that even have a live overnight radio show. I don't think there is such a thing. And so there's that kind of opportunity doesn't exist anymore. So now you have to go about it in different ways. And now I think there are more intern programs and people going to college and studying communications and or journalism or something associated with the field, and they kind of get into it that way. I know 10 years ago, about 12 years ago, I was at that point the vice president of operations and programming for a company that had 43 radio stations in the Pacific Northwest. And that's what we had mostly. It was just young people who were trying to get a break, and they did it in a small town. And that part is still the same. You start in a small town, kind of work your way up, and work your way up, and work your way up until you get to what we used to call the majors.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably one of the most common parts as it was back in the day. Still, you start from the very bottom and work your way up,
Well, at the same time, while there aren't those kind of opportunities to do a career the way I did it, there are, because of the internet and so forth, there are a lot of other opportunities. There are so many different ways you can do radio now without necessarily ever walking into a radio station. And you can do it right, like you said, right from your. In my case, I have a home studio anyway. I had a studio in Nashville for years. I got into the music end of things, and I still have a music studio here in my house. But I used it to do those radio shows in Chicago when I was in Oklahoma, and it was great. I thought could not have done that back in my day. But the big difference probably between then and now is back in my day, if you were a disc jockey at a really big radio station at a good-sized market, and the station had really high ratings, everybody knew who you were, and it was a very different world than they have now. Because first of all, radio was a really big thing back then. There was hardly anybody didn't listen to the radio. So if you had 40 share of audience, you had a lot of people listening to your radio show. And I remember when I worked in Chicago, I actually had 2 million listeners a week.
Wow.
And it blew my mind to know that. Then I went to New York and had the same thing there with lesser ratings, but that's because there were more people.
Yeah, it seems to change wherever you go, but that happens, because there's a different audience for each radio show you do.
Well, I guess part of the point of what I was making, we were talking about the fact that you could actually get 35 and 40% of an audience in a big market in those days, and more generally 25 to 30 for a really big radio station. These days, the number one station might have a 6 share or 7 share. Because there's so many radio stations, and they're all kind of doing the same thing so many times that it's just all thinned out and spread out. So it's a whole different business now, and it's not one that, frankly, that I would get as excited about it, I think, as I did as a kid when I found myself on the radio in Philadelphia. But it's still, it's still kind of the same thing, but radio's not the same. But it's part of show business, and doing that kind of thing is still popular, even though not in the same way it was then. Did that make any sense with that?
Yeah, you do. Yeah, it's popular, but it's just a different revenue these days.
Yeah, it's a different type of popular. It's kind of like, it just kind of fits into everything, whereas in those days it stood out from everything.
Yeah. Because back then, and still today, but back then radio was just in its prime. It was had a.
You're right. It was really kind of a great golden era of radio, as far as I'm concerned. And of course, you can always say the real great golden era of radio was 10, 15 years before that, when Jack Benny and all those people were dominating the airwaves, and everybody listened to radio, and there was no television. I was brought up in that era. I never had a television in my house until I was 13. So I was brought up listening to the radio, and I loved the radio. And when I got a chance to be on the radio, I certainly wasn't going to pass up on it, just like you. That's the kind of guy you are, too, apparently. You wouldn't pass up on that chance ever. Am I right?
Oh, yeah. I've been doing my show for 6 years, and...
Wow.
Thank you.
You started really young then.
Yeah, I was 13 when I started, and I've been doing it ever since. I've interviewed people, and I have another show where I play music, oldies music, classics, Sinatra, all that kind of good music. But
well, that's the first stuff I played on the radio.
Yeah, the music.
The only difference is it was still kind of new then.
Yeah.
But I was playing Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly when they were new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all the great singers back then. But it surprises me, that their music is still listened to today.
Well, it's great stuff. Of course, I have a lot of personal pride in it, because of the places I worked and the kind of people I became friends with. I got to know a lot of those stars really, really well, and some of them became my friends. And that was just a very exciting time in rock and roll. And today, that's all different too. That's another whole subject. But the music business is totally different now than it was then too. So I realize I'm what you call a dinosaur. But I'm still roaming the earth and having a good time.
Yeah, well, you have to, you have to have fun in life. If you're not having fun, then what's the point? You have to enjoy.
Trey, for a young man, your philosophy is right spot on.
Thank you very much. I get that a lot. People say I don't sound. I'm 18, but people say I don't look or sound young. They kind of see me as an old soul, I guess.
Well, Trey, that's the impression I'm getting. It seems like you come from a place that's a little beyond the average experience of somebody in their upper teens. And that would include me when I first got to Philadelphia. I was so naive, I didn't know which way I was going. I learned fast, but I was pretty naive. And actually, it was a couple of people who were at that time rock and roll stars who really helped me a whole lot to grow into that role and understand what it's all about.
Yeah, but it is a great business to be in. You just have to know where to start and enjoy it. That's the main thing.
Well, the great thing about today is a creative person such as yourself. They're all. You can really almost do it any way you envision. It's interesting. As I told you, I've done a lot of music production as well, and editing music and all that. And I remember back in the old days, I used to dream of being able to edit music the way I now can with my Pro Tools in my studio. I can make anything happen now. And it used to be you had splicing tape and you had tape hanging around your neck, and it was just a whole different thing to what you do now with the wonderful digital world we live in.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Brink, it's been a pleasure talking to you and hearing about your career and sharing the advice you can, since you're retired, but you shared some great pieces of advice, though. And thank you very much for letting me.
It was a pleasure talking to you. Hope you'll stay in touch, and thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you very much. You have a good day.
You too. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And that was former radio host, Mr. Scotty Brink. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope we gave you some informative piece of information and some entertainment for your day. God bless you all. Thank you.